Howdy, Johnny Ketlo here, Clan Dakelh from Nadleh Whut'en. I'm just going to read to you today from the Smithsonian Institution, Bureau of American Ethnology, by a guy named Diamond Jenness. It's called The Carrier Indians of the Bulkley River, Their Social and Religious Life. So this report is the outcome of a visit to the northern interior of British Columbia during the winter of 1924 and 25, when I spent 3 months at Hazelton and Hagglget and periods of about a week each at Fort Fraser, Stony Creek, and Prince George. I made no attempts to investigate the material, culture, or the language of the Carrier Indians, since these subjects had been adequately covered by Father Maurice. The spelling of the numerous Indian names has presented some difficulty. In the field, they were recorded phonetically, but since this report has little value for linguistics, and a welter of phonetic symbols would unnecessarily increase the difficulties of the reader, the words have been reduced to their nearest equivalents in English spelling, and only those special characters retained that seemed absolutely indispensable. The folk tales collected during the same winter have already been published under the title Myths of the Carrier Indians of British Columbia, see Jenness 1934. The Carrier Indians of the Bulkley River, Their Social and Religious Life, by Diamond Jenness. Location and relations with neighboring peoples. The westernmost subtribe of the Carrier Indians, the Wet'suwet'en, clever people, as it called itself, occupied the basin of the Bulkley River, an important tributary of the Skeena in North British Columbia, together with a block of territory that extended for an uncertain distance to the south. Flanking it on three sides were other subtribes of the same Carrier nation, but on the west were Gitxsan Indians of the Tsimshian stock, whose nearest village, Hazelton, lay only 4 miles from the Carrier village of Hagglget. After 1800, there were many disturbances of population in this area due to epidemics of diseases, the growth of European settlements, and the greater ease of communication through the building of roads and a railway. Many Carrier families were blotted out and their places taken by immigrant families from other districts. And there was much intermarriage with the neighboring Gitxsan Indians. Today, the subtribe numbers rather more than 300 and it has 2 main settlements, Hagglget and Morristown, while a few families reside at other villages along the line of the Transcontinental Railway. Some of the Indians remain in their settlements through the entire year. Others cut ties for the railway in winter, or hunt and trap in remote districts where the land is not yet preempted by white settlers and game still survives in fair numbers. 2 or 3 families even roam occasionally as far south as the Itzuk Lake area, which the Bulkley people incorporated into their territory after the earlier inhabitants, who seem to have formed a distinct subtribe, were destroyed by an epidemic of smallpox about 1838. In summer, again, there's generally a slight movement to the coast, where a few natives find employment in the salmon canneries during the fishing season. Earlier history. To recover the history of this Bulkley River subtribe prior to the 19th century seems impossible. Its members claim that they originally possessed one village only, Dizkul, dead trees all pointed in one direction, which they located on a site now farmed by a white man at Mosquito Flat, 12 miles east of Hazelton on the Bulkley River. Here, whither the salmon ascended in huge shoals, the Indians had built houses on both sides of the river and constructed a dam from one bank to the other. The cluster of houses on the right bank was known as Quatso Excreta, and the larger cluster on the left bank, Hawillamax, place where people throw away turnips, because in the vicinity were many wild turnips that the Indians both roasted for food and tossed like balls to one another on a large sandbar in the middle of the river. Hawillamax boasted of one very large house, Sam Dek, said to be buried now 2.5 feet under the ground, which was the residence of Guxlet, the chief of a small section of the sub-tribe. The Thin House clan of the Gilserhayu phratry, for though all members of the sub-tribe and even Gitxsan Indians from the Skeena River, carriers of the Babyan Lake sub-tribe, and Sekani from beyond Babyan Lake, gathered at Dakelh each year to trap the migrating salmon. The surrounding territory, called Dakelh, like the village, was the hunting reserve of this one section of the Bulkley sub-tribe, and no one might hunt there except members of the same phratry. The Hagwelget Canyon, then as now, was the boundary line between the Bulkley carrier and the Gitxsan Indians, who had a permanent home of their own at Tamlaham, 4 miles below Hazelton. And the dispersal of the two peoples from their respective villages, Dakelh and Tamlaham, led to the establishment of all the modern villages in the area. To Morristown and Hagwelget by the carrier sub-tribe, and to Hazelton, Kitwanga, and other places by the Gitxsan. So runs one tradition of the carrier. According to another, Dakelh was the original home of 3 distinct tribes, the Western carrier, the Sekani, and the Gitxsan. Superstitious fear, when 2 squirrels inspected their dam, made them scatter and flee to their present homes, and the passage of years had produced their present differentiation. I have examined the supposed site of Dakelh, and Harlan I. Smith, archaeologist of the National Museum of Canada, has visited the traditional site of Tamlaham. In neither place did we discern any traces of a permanent settlement. One may reasonably doubt, therefore, whether the 2 villages glorified by similar legends ever held the prominent place that tradition assigns to them, if indeed they ever existed outside the fertile imaginations of the Indians. That's kind of rough. At the opening of the 19th century, the principal fishing place and village of the Bulkley carrier was at Morristown. Hagwelget was established only about 1820, when a rock slide in its canyon almost blocked the river and allowed very few salmon to pass beyond. Most of the inhabitants of Morristown then moved en masse to the canyon and built new homes on a narrow shelf below it, but they abandoned their rather inaccessible site toward the end of the century and established their present village on the terrace above. The last survivor of the migration from Morristown, Satsan, died in 1914 at the age of about 90. Relations with surrounding peoples. Ease of travel in modern times has brought the Bulkley Indians greater knowledge of their fellow carriers to the east, and revealed to them other Indian tribes in British Columbia of whom they were ignorant in early days. This greater knowledge is reflected in the accompanying sketch map, which outlines their conception of the names and boundaries of their own and other carrier sub-tribes in the latter half of the last century. Of the easternmost carrier, they apparently knew very little until recently, but with their fellow carriers of Babine and Fraser Lake, the Bulkley people always maintained close and friendly relations, marred in the case of the Fraser Lake Indians by only one feud of which they retain any recollection. Equally friendly were the relations with Gitxsan Indians. The differences in their speech neither debarred intermarriage nor hindered the Bulkley Indians from absorbing many cultural traits from their more advanced neighbors. The Gitxsan controlled the trade route down the Skeena River to the coast that brought to the carrier objects of shell and copper in exchange for moose hides and various furs. The coast Tsimshian, who were the principals in this trade, tried to eliminate the Gitxsan middlemen about 1850, and, themselves ascending the Skeena, established a yearly market on an open flat at the junction of that river with the Bulkley. There, for several years, they carried on so amicable a trade with the carrier that a few of the latter ventured to accompany them back to the coast, and to pass the winter months in their midst. But about 1866, a quarrel over some transaction led to a fight in which both sides sustained several casualties. One account states that the Tsimshian returned the following summer and demanded the surrender of the Bulkley River Valley in compensation for their losses, but that they never took possession of the area. Though the carrier agreed to their terms, more credible, however, is the following version of the conflict and its issue. So here we go. The Tsimshian ascended the Skeena in about 50 canoes and camped at Mission Flat, where the river is joined by the Bulkley. In the course of bartering, a Hagilget Indian quarreled with a Tsimshian man over the price of some article and fired his gun to intimidate the dealer. Thereupon the Tsimshian, fearing treachery, seized their weapons and shot indiscriminately at men, women, and children. And the Hagilget natives retaliated. Finally, the latter retreated to their village, and the Tsimshian, loading up their canoes, hurried back to the coast. For 3 years they did not return. Then a large party appeared in 10 canoes, and the two people concluded peace at a great potlatch, batlats, in which the Tsimshian, as the aggressors in the fight, paid compensation for every carrier who was slain. Besides the Tsimshian proper, Indians where the Nass River visited the Bulkley carrier in order to barter Ulakan grease for marten and other furs. And more than once the carrier, pressed by famine toward the end of the winter, themselves traveled through the territory of the Gitxsan to one or other of the Nass villages in order to purchase Ulakan and other food. Yet they have always disliked the Nass River people and still remember with bitterness an episode that occurred about 1864. The story, as related by one of the last survivors, who in 1924 was a blind old man tottering toward his grave, throws an interesting light on the customs of the Indians at the time. And here it is. One winter, when our people were starving, my family, together with my uncle Gaidamskanish, Bini, the chief of the Beaver Fratry, and many others, traveled overland to Gitlakstamsk's village on the Nass River to buy Ulakan grease. Soon after our arrival, my father discovered that one of the inhabitants bore the same title and crest as himself, and claiming kinship, ordered me to lodge for the night with his namesake, while he and the rest of the family lodged elsewhere. He came to the door early next morning and said to me, "We have bought all we want and will leave the village before noon." So a number of us started back for Hagilget, and after traveling a few miles, camped near a stump that supported a huge stone. I and some other youths tried to turn to push this stone over, and when it crashed on the ground, under our united efforts, we raised a shout of victory and returned to our camp. Now, some Gitwinkle men who were passing heard our shouts and came to see what was happening. My father said to them, "Our lads were merely pushing a stone off a stump." And they answered, "That was the gravestone of the late chief of the village." Greatly alarmed, my father begged them to keep the deed secret, but they immediately went on to the village and spread the news everywhere. Then a woman rushed weeping into a house where some of our people were eating and cried, "Why do we feast these wretches? They have disturbed the grave of our chief." About half our people, led by Binny, retreated inside another house. The rest hastened after us and told us to flee, because Nass, Kispioks, and Gitwinkle Indians were all mustering in pursuit. We did flee, but the Nass natives overtook and captured those who were in the rear. One captive, a noble woman named Anklo, they proposed to enslave, but she said to them, "You cannot make me a slave, for I am the daughter of a chief. If you carry me off as a captive, you must take also 2 slave girls for me to lean upon. Besides, why do you want to make me a prisoner? Neither I nor my family touched the grave, but Gaidamskanish yonder and his family. They led her away nevertheless, and with her 2 slave women to attend her wants." The Kispioks Indian then disarmed Gaidamskanish, who said to them, Remember that I am a chief. What are you going to do with me?" "You must return with us," they answered, "to pay for the insult you offered the grave." "Take my brother also," he said. "We will die together." And when they paid no attention to his words, he turned to his brother and said, "Come, let us go together." The two men were led out onto the ice of the river and ordered to run up and down while their enemies mocked them and shot at them with guns. Damskanish's brother dropped dead at the first shot, but Damskanish himself, though frequently wounded, ran up and down for nearly half an hour before he fell with a bullet through his thigh. The Nass Indians then burned their corpses and returned to Gitlakhtstamsk. Meanwhile, an influential Indian had concealed another of my uncles inside a large chest. And when the villagers searched the house, sat on top of it, and refused to move away, his countrymen dared not disturb him on account of his high rank. My uncle's wife stood near him, grasping a large knife in readiness to stab the first man who molested her husband or herself, but no one laid a hand on her. Binny and the rest of our people barricaded themselves inside another house throughout the night, while their enemies threatened them from outside and occasionally fired off their guns. Early the following morning, the principal chief of the village sent around word to all the houses that the fighting should cease and that our people should move over to his house along a path strewn with the white eagle down. The white eagle down that symbolizes peace. Preceded by a messenger carrying a white feather, he then conducted them to our camp. A day's journey away, and we returned home without further mishap. Sometime afterward, a party of Nass Indians came to Hazelton to conclude a peace with us. They assembled within the potlatch house beside a huge pile of blankets, and we went down from Hegelgat and stood outside, myself and another youth, the nearest relatives of Damskanish, in the forefront. After our enemies had presented us with a number of blankets, we followed them inside the house and ranged ourselves along one wall while they lined up against the other. Every man was dressed in his finest clothes and carried a gun and a knife. But, to prevent trouble, I and my companions sat in front of the Nass River chief, and two Nass youths occupied corresponding places in front of our chief. As soon as we were thus seated, the two ringleaders in the murder approached us and placed a red-tipped feather on each of our heads to indicate that they intended to pay full compensation. Then one of them delivered a speech declaring that they wanted to make peace, and shaking a rattle, danced and sang a sonal. The sonal that he sang is a special chant used by Carrier, Tsimshian, Haida, Kitimat, Belakula, and other tribes whenever they make peace with each other. Though I know the words, I cannot understand their meaning because they are in neither the Tsimshian nor the Carrier tongue. As the man repeated the song, both his Nass companions and my own people joined in. I, for my part, rose to my feet and, to show that he was smoothing out the issue, held flat on my outstretched palm a tail feather from an eagle. But before the singing ended, I thought to myself, they haven't paid us enough, and I turned the feather on its edge. Immediately the man broke off his chant, and his people added more blankets to those they had surrendered to us already. He then began his song anew, and this time I held the feather flat on my hand until he ended. Since we all felt too sad to hold a feast in common, my kinsmen, without further delay, gathered up the blankets and returned to Hegelgat, while I and my companion, to cement the peace, stayed 4 days in Hazelton with the Nass Indians and danced with them each evening. 2 years after my uncles were murdered, some of us went over to the Nass River, collected their bones, and deposited them on top of a pole at Hegelgat. At the same time, we brought back Damskanish's widow, who the Nass Indians had detained after her husband's death. And we'll stop there for today. So that's been the first in the video log, just reading some history from the Smithsonian. Thank you very much.